So my journey or path into journalism has to be described as an unconventional one. I was actually born into a literary family. My mother was a novelist, but my father was American, musical, completely different background. So I went to school in London, studied well for the first little while, but then kind of began to, I think, drop out of making the effort to be a good schoolboy, a good student. And I began to work I began to find the world of actual work far more interesting and inspiring than the world of academic schoolwork. So I did all sorts of things. I did work in a dairy. I worked in betting shops. And then it was through betting shops that I met a man called Jim Kremin, who will probably not remember me, but I remember him well. His job was greyhound editor of the Racing Post. And he said, you should write about it. You should write. You can express yourself. You should write. So I ended up writing a few pieces for the Racing Post for Jim. And then I started sub-editing. And then I decided I must actually stop doing these silly jobs like cleaning dairy trucks and stopping tramps beating each other up in betting shops. So I must do something a bit more, if you don't mind my saying, middle class and perhaps even better paid. So I thought journalism, and I realized I could write. And I began to do subbing shifts in car magazines because cars and motorsport have always been my absolute passion. And then I ended up getting a job on Car Magazine itself. That was my first proper, full-time media job. And I developed there and I was promoted there. And then Haymarket was launching F1 Racing magazine. And they launched it with a skeleton staff from Autosport magazine. The acting editor was a man called Mike Hurd. Very good guy. He had been deputy editor of Autosport, but they launched it with him as the kind of caretaker editor. And after about 6 months, he didn't want to do that. In fact, he went on to work for The Guardian. And they were looking for the first kind of full-time editor to take the job on. And so Haymarket, Mel Nichols and Steve Cropley knew of me. They'd seen me at launches. They'd read my stuff on Car Magazine. And both of those guys had worked for Car Magazine before. And they asked me to come in and see them, and I saw them, and they offered me the job. And that was in 1996, only a few months after F1 Racing had been launched. And prior to F1 Racing, Formula One reporting had been just that, reporting. It had been a bit of news, but mostly reporting on the race. This is what happened on lap 1. This person overtook. This person had a shunt, this person won. That had started in the 60s and 70s before Formula One was even on television. And when I fell in love with the sport in the early 70s, Monaco, Monza and the British Grand Prix were on television. Otherwise, it was impossible to watch on television. There wasn't usually even a report in the newspaper on Monday. So you had to wait till Wednesday morning to read motoring news, now motorsport news, and Autocar, and then Thursday for Autosport, to even find out who'd won. Now, by the mid-90s, that wasn't the case. They were on television, so there was no point waiting for a rehash of what you'd just seen. So we began to tell the backstories. And I'm absolutely firmly of the belief that that was the secret of F1 Racing's success. Telling the backstories. Yes, Michael Schumacher has just won the Spanish Grand Prix. You know that, dear reader. So let's find out what was going on behind the scenes. The stories you didn't get told by Murray Walker when you tuned in to watch the race. The other thing we did, which some people criticized us for, purists criticized us for, the writers I began to feature. So if, let's say, Peter Windsor, who I hired, Peter had been out of journalism, and I persuaded him to come and join F1 Racing. And he always says that he agreed to come and write for me at F1 Racing when I began to talk to him about Carlos Reutemann and Patrick Depailler. because he thought, yeah, this is a guy who understands my kind of racing driver. Anyway, I made a big thing of Peter, and I absolutely pushed the picture byline with Peter, with Alan Henry, who again I was able to attract to write for the magazine, youngsters like Tom Clarkson. We even hired Stefan Sampson, who wrote in French and we translated, but you'd never notice because we carefully subbed it. And we did that because of his contacts within Ferrari and Renault, and because of his great creativity, and various others. And also photography. We realized that the magazine had to look good. Reporting wasn't what it was about. It was about celebrating the beauty of the most photogenic sport that there is. So Darren Heath, who was and still is the best photographer in the sport, an amazing run. You know, he's been doing it now for 30 years. He's a great friend of mine. So we had really, what did we have? The best words, the best pictures, and great design. People like Steve Moore and Duncan Spires, people who aren't known by Formula One people, but actually made that magazine. Liz Wallace as well made that magazine look as good as it did, and it was innovative, and it did win awards. And I began to not only edit it, but write in it a lot myself. People used to be irritated because if Peter was interviewing Ralf Schumacher, Peter would be pictured with Ralf Schumacher. If I was interviewing Giancarlo Fisichella, I would be pictured there. Not huge, but I'd be in the picture, because we wanted to show our readers that we had three things: style, the style I've just described; access, and authority. The authority came from the good words, the style from the good pictures and good design, but the access, we wanted to show the readers who were spending anything between £2.50 to £5 during the time of my editorship, when they could actually watch it on television for free, and it was being reported on in the newspapers anyway by then. We wanted to show them that for your money, you're getting people who were actually there, who do actually know these people, and are bringing you unique, exclusive insights that you will get no other way other than buying F1 Racing. And you know what? It worked. When I joined in December 1996, it was on sale in one country, in one language, the UK English. Very soon, Dutch and German editions were introduced. By the time I left, 11 years later in 2007, it was on sale in 34 languages in 110 countries and selling more than about 1.3 million copies every month. It had become a huge success. Every time I went to a Grand Prix, I arrived with, sackfuls of copies of F1 Racing and handed them out, and to the drivers, to the team principals, to the key people, which nobody else was doing. So, and I wanted to do that. I often did it on the Sunday, so they had something to read on the way home. And I remember seeing them. It was always very satisfying to get on the plane and seeing, Jarno Trulli or Patrick Head reading the magazine and thinking, that's good. It's obviously beginning to get under the skin of people, and it's beginning to be something that that people are reading and therefore are wanting to appear in. There was that. We did actually make an effort to befriend drivers, and we all got to know different ones. I was particularly friendly with Mika Hakkinen, with Damon Hill, still am, with Giancarlo Fisichella, Alex Wirtz, still one of my very best friends. Tom Clarkson, for instance, befriended Juan Pablo Montoya. Peter Windsor, very much a Michael Schumacher man at that time, and Ralf Schumacher. So I think we actually befriended them, managed to befriend them, and also made sure that there was money in the budget to buy them free lunches and dinners. A racing driver will, even if he's on 40 million, he's not likely to buy the dinner. It has to be you that buys the dinner. So there was a bit of that. And then we decided that we were going to also appeal to their narcissism by making sure that the photo shoots were great. So Darren Heath, brilliant at action photography and good at portraiture as well. But we also began to bring other portrait artists, real fashion photographers, to races. That had never been done before. And appeal, in a sense, to racing drivers' vanity. Look how good we can make you look. And they did like that. And I think we began to have a lot of success in that way. Maybe the most famous story, though, in my early days was in 1997, and that was the famous McLaren brake pedal story. Now, we happened to know via sources, there you are, journalistic phrase, we happened to know via sources that the McLaren might have a trick second brake pedal in the footwell. So we had determined that if the McLarens broke down that day, that Darren would jump on a paddock bike, which I think he blagged from Jordan, to be able to be at the corner wherever it was. And I remember seeing the TV pictures, of course, and picking up the phone, ringing Darren, "Get down to the end of the pit straight. Both of them are stopped." So Darren jumped on his Jordan paddock bike, whizzed down there, and as the marshals were closing in to say, "What the hell are you doing?" But he could get his camera right the way down into Häkkinen's footwell. Of course, this is pre-digital, and he was just blind, photographing. He couldn't see what he was photographing. And then, of course, he came back. We didn't find the films until they were developed. And then I remember bending over the light box and just looking at the pictures and seeing we had this absolutely perfect shot of Häkkinen's footwell, showing accelerator pedal, brake pedal, secondary brake pedal. And we published it over a big double-page spread. That was a huge scoop, absolutely huge scoop, because all the other teams started working on such a system. And it so happened that Ron Dennis got to hear about it because there was a team principals meeting, probably at Heathrow or somewhere like that. And Max Mosley had a copy of F1 Racing. And he waited till, because of course Max Mosley and Ron Dennis not friends, as you know. And Max waited till the beginning of the meeting and said, "Okay, gentlemen, right, let's begin. Oh, Ron, you might like to see this." He held it up and then put it down, and poor old Ron had to sit through the whole meeting, a couple of hours, itching to see what this story had been, but having to go through the minutes and sit there with, John Todd and all the others. So as the years rolled by and F1 racing became more and more successful, adding more and more foreign language editions and becoming required reading by fans, by other media, and by Formula One insiders. And that gave it a power. It gave all of us who were privileged to work for it, including me as its editor, but all the others, great power. Because I used to say, by all means, if like we're looking for 40 minutes with Mika Häkkinen, by all means, you may want to give that access to another magazine, Auto Sprint, 50,000 copies in Italy alone, or you can give the same 40 minutes to me and my magazine, and you'll get 1.3 million in 34 languages in 110 countries. So you choose. Which would your sponsors prefer? And it was a powerful and compelling argument. So we began to be known as the best-selling, the biggest, the most influential, and the most powerful. It was great fun, by the way. We also had a responsibility then also to try not to abuse that power and try to be not too impartial. Sometimes struggled, I think, it's fair to say. Partly because during that period, Ferrari and Michael Schumacher became so extraordinarily dominant that it was actually quite difficult to find a way that the sport itself could be compellingly interesting. So during that period, and I believe we did manage to do this to some extent, we actually made F1 Racing magazine more interesting than Formula One itself. That sounds like an extraordinary conceited boast. I really don't mean it to be like that, partly because it was because of the efforts of the brilliant colleagues that I hired. So I'm not claiming it, but also because Formula One was pretty dull at that time. Michael Schumacher was going to win every race. You knew that when you arrived. Live sport requires an element of suspense, and that suspense was absent. So we had to fill the gap. At the same time, the politics of the sport was at its absolute height. You had Bernie Ecclestone and Max Mosley on the one hand, at the height of their powers. Bernie Ecclestone, the iron fist in Max Mosley's velvet glove. Very different types, but an unbeatably powerful, scarily powerful combination. And those who would seek to combat them or stand in their way, and there were, among the teams in those days, again to a greater extent than there are now, there were grandee team owners, people like Ron Dennis, Frank Williams, Ken Tyrrell, people who had been in the sport for donkey's years already, owned their teams, were rich men in their own right, were entrepreneurs, were courageous and bullish about their ability to have things their own way, and came up against the iron fist and the velvet glove of Ecclestone and Mosley. That was an interesting situation upon which to report. I remember the day I decided to give Max Mosley a column in F1 Racing. I don't think he's ever written a column for a magazine, but he wrote 12 columns in 1 year for F1 Racing. He would only do that because he knew that his column would be required reading and would be available in all these different languages so that everyone in the FIA would read it in all far-flung corners of the world. But he also knew that the team bosses would read it. And Ron was not happy that I gave him that column, I remember. Why are you giving him a monthly platform? Because he's the president of the FIA, Ron. Doesn't matter. Well, it does. And yeah, I mean, at that time, very, very privileged, very, very lucky to be able to be in a privileged position reporting right at the center of the most explosive political events in the sport. I mean, of course, it's still political, but not in the way that it used to be then. So my last year at F1 Racing as editor of F1 Racing was 2007. And by that time already, the whole digital explosion had begun. And F1 Racing sales were still strong, but beginning to slide, as all magazines. I think I probably had the most enjoyable time. I loved crafting the words. I loved the fact that our writers weighed every word and created, a fluent and elegant piece of prose, which took them time to do, and that therefore matched the beauty of the design and the beauty of the photographs. But you can't do that in the digital age nearly so much because it's all about speed. Well, speed is extremely important. Any article that is written about Formula One now must, I think it's fair to say, perforce contain only facts that the reader already knows, only insights that the reader already knows. They may not have been presented in the same way or in the same combination, but it's very, very unusual to read a long-form piece of writing that contains new info or new insight. At one time during the course of 2007, I began to think, the next offer I get from a team, I might take. Maybe magazine publishing has seen its heyday. But then in 2007, which of course was the infamous year of Spygate, I was in frequent communication with both Ron Dennis, because I knew him well, and Max Mosley, because I knew him well. And I was supposed to be writing and editing impartially on this absolute tinderbox of political intrigue and trouble, fueled by personal animosities and ambition and anger. I remember during the course of it thinking, Max Mosley was very well served by Richard Woods, who is a brilliant PR, comms, spin doctor extraordinaire, a really good practitioner, very, very able, exactly right for what Max wanted him to do at that time. And Ron, who had never really rated PR, he never really rated journalism, didn't have that kind of strategic comms director. He had very good people, and I remember at the Turkish Grand Prix in 2007, on the Thursday, he called me and asked me to join him in his office in the McLaren Brand Centre. And this was all kicking off by now. This was all in the press. And the media narrative was being successfully controlled by Richard Woods and to some extent Luca Collegiani at Ferrari, but not by McLaren. McLaren was reeling daily from each new day's bulletin. And Ron said, I'd like you to come and work for me. Because Ron loves negotiating almost more than anything else, astonishingly, we took 3 Grand Prix to agree terms. Turkey, Monza and Spa. Frequent meetings. And I remember going in to Woking on the Monday after the Belgian Grand Prix to sign the contract, which was huge, McLaren style, 60 pages. And Ron and I sat there and initialed RD, MD, MB at the bottom of every page and then signed it. And then I went to Haymarket, Teddington and gave my notice in. And I remember feeling, I'll always love F1 racing. It'll always be a wonderful 11 years I spent in the editor's chair. But here, I was joining McLaren. Now, if you're a Formula One person, particularly then, sad to say not so much now, but certainly then, McLaren was the destination job unless you were Italian. And as I walked out of there thinking, Director of Communications, McLaren, my goodness, yeah, it was a good day. And it began an extraordinary 10-year roller coaster at McLaren. So when I started at McLaren, which was the 2nd of January 2008, because Haymarket made me do some gardening leave at the end of 2007, that happens. That was a company reeling from Spygate. It had to pay a $100 million fine, very famously, but had managed to do that, but was very much on the back foot. And there was a defensive pessimism around Woking, around the McLaren Technology Centre, quite understandably, because 2007 had been nearly a terminal problem for McLaren. And it had been difficult for Ron personally, of course, a proud man who'd always been uber successful at what he had done. But I also found things I didn't expect. From the outside, particularly at that time, McLaren was absolutely the house that Ron built at that time. Ron famously, his favorite color grey, his private jet has the registration number Greys, he wears grey suits, he likes grey carpets, and people like to take the mickey out of this, but it's all about this uber careful attention to detail. And he was the first to do that and innovated enormously around that. And the cars always looked fantastic. And the garages always looked fantastic. And that was absolutely something that sponsors bought into. And Ron and Ekram Sami, who worked with him at that time for many, many years, hugely successful, brilliant bloke, Ekram, they worked together and they broke the mold when it came to presenting a Formula One team so that it would be investable by corporates. Brilliant. Anyway, I expected all of that. What I didn't expect was the warmth. And I was astonished by that. And I think that's actually something, the esprit de corps you have in a team, which again, if I'd known more about that when I was a journalist and an editor, I'd have brought that out too, because I didn't know it was there. But it is there, and it's not brought out now. And when you actually work in the middle of that, you realize this is a team. This really is a team. So that became an interesting, welcome and exciting discovery for me. And then we started, and we went down to Melbourne for the first race. And you have to remember, McLaren had nearly ceased to operate the year before. And we won. We won the first race. Lewis Hamilton. Looking around me, I saw I must admit, tearful joy among those McLaren mechanics, engineers, marketers, catering people, senior management, everybody, choking back the tears, and some not managing to choke back the tears because of what had happened the year before. And here we were, we went down to Melbourne and we won. That was an astonishing thing to be in the centre of. And of course, we won the World Championship that year in the most dramatic way that there has ever been. I'm a massive Lewis Hamilton fan. And he was carrying the mantle because, of course, Fernando Alonso had departed in difficult circumstances. So Lewis was carrying the torch for McLaren and taking the battle to Ferrari on track. In the closing stages, there we were, Lewis Hamilton in 6th place. He had to be 5th. Had to be 5th. Otherwise, every gram of effort that had gone through that entire year, a year of effort and redemption, or hopeful redemption, immediately following Spygate, every gram would be wasted. And you remember what happened. Lewis lost 5th place to Vettel in the Toro Rosso, and then Lewis began to lunge at Vettel, trying to get that 5th place back. But every time he lunged, Vettel just got the power down and disappeared down the straight again. And we all began to hope, but also fear. I remember sitting in the garage and looking at the guys, looking at the monitors, looking at everyone. And I could see everyone was muttering. And everyone was doing this. Come on, Lewis. Come on, mate. Come on, Lewis. And of course you couldn't hear, because in those days, Formula One engines were very loud. So you couldn't hear a thing. But everyone was mouthing these words, and I found I was too. At the very end, this is boys' own stuff, isn't it? This is really astonishing sporting drama. We're talking about the last corner of the last lap of the last race, by which time Felipe Massa was celebrating not only victory, but also his World Championship. At that same period, we suddenly all saw, as everybody did sitting on their sofas, that it wasn't Vettel who Hamilton was going to pass, it was Glock. The Toyota was going slowly. And I can't really talk about it without getting emotional now. It was one of the most extraordinary moments of my life. And I remember just rushing, we all did, we just rushed across the garage, across the pit lane, to the pit wall. It just is that shared drama, lots of tears, lots of joy. And then, of course, in the utterly congested Interlagos paddock, old-fashioned paddock, taking Lewis from TV crew to TV crew. And I remember being bumped because there's no space, TV cameras banging into your head as you were just taking Lewis through. And I remember at one particular time, Lewis was standing there and a whole lot of TV cameras in his face and being interviewed, and I was standing there. And then lower down, in between the legs of the cameramen and the interviewers, this little figure appeared in red. And I looked down, and this little figure crawled through and looked up. Felipe Massa. Felipe Massa put his hand out and reached to Lewis and said, "Congratulations, Lewis, congratulations." I tell you what, that is class behaviour, world-class behaviour. I'll never forget, I think, class act, Felipe Massa doing that day. And Lewis certainly saw that and recognised it for what it was. So the 2009 season started very badly for McLaren. The car was dreadful. The car was dreadful. We found out in testing that it was going to be dreadful. We decided to admit publicly that it was going to achieve poor results. A bit of expectation management in the media, also much better than telling porcupines. Let's be honest about it. We're not going to be good at the beginning of this year. And we really weren't. But massive credit to the McLaren engineers who just worked and worked and worked. And Formula One is not about magic bullets and great discoveries like in the Colin Chapman era when I've invented ground effect. Let's just make a car that wins every race. That doesn't happen anymore. It's all about iterative improvements. And the McLaren engineers, brilliant performance, making iterative improvements until finally we got to Hungary, which was a circuit which would help us. And Lewis put it on pole and won. And I remember speaking to him, as he walked back into the McLaren brand centre, hot and sweaty and delighted. And I remember him saying, "Matt, do the sum, do the sum. How many races left have we got? If we win every single one, we can still win this World Championship." And that was Lewis. Nothing, absolutely nothing about, oh, thank goodness, we've made it less disgraceful by winning a race. No. Matt, go and do the sum. If we win every single race now, we can still win this World Championship. That's the mark of a winner. Lewis Hamilton is a much misunderstood person. He lives his life in some ways on social media, and most people experience him on social media. And now, of course, he has the trappings of great wealth. His sartorial choices are eccentric. He rubs shoulders with superstars outside of the sport. He's as rich as you could want to be. He's got his dogs. He's got his big red jet. But Lewis is still an extremely warm person. And I want to tell you a story. My mother was dying of cancer at that time. And it so happens that Lewis had spoken to my mother on the phone in the past. She was already not well, and he knew that. But I happened to be talking to him or briefing him, doing a media briefing, and my phone rang, and he saw it, said, "Mum," and I was doing something else. So he answered. He answered, and he spoke to my mother, and he said, "I gather you're fighting cancer, and you need to be really proud of your son. He's doing such a great job," and all this. My mother told me later what he had said. When I walked back, Lewis didn't even tell me that he'd answered my phone and that it had been my mother. It was my mother who told me sometime later. Anyway, that was 2012, when she was ill with cancer, but not in the last stages. In 2013, which is the year she died, she was in the last stages. And the German Grand Prix, she died on the Thursday before the German Grand Prix. So I called my great friend and colleague, Steve Cooper, who works for McLaren still. And I said, "Steve, I'm not going to be able to come to Germany because my mother's just passed away." Anyway, I was sitting in my mother's front room in North London, where she used to live. And at 10 o'clock at night, my phone rang. Lewis Hamilton. I answered the phone. "Hi, Lewis." Now, obviously, when I said "Hi, Lewis," everybody in the room paid attention and went quiet, because it's not such a common name, and they knew what Lewis that must be because they knew what job I did. Remember, he didn't work in the same team, didn't drive for the same team as I did. I was very surprised. I said, "Lewis, I'm not in Germany." He said, "I know you're not in Germany. I know you're not in Germany. I've just this moment heard that your mother passed away today. She was a great lady. And I just want to say that you have all my condolences. And if you're with your family this evening, please pass on my condolences to all of them and tell them that I will remember her in my prayers tonight." Again, first-class behavior, eh? Proper behavior. And people don't see that side of Lewis, a soulful, kind-hearted man. They just see the Instagram version. So during 2012, it became obvious that Lewis perhaps had itchy feet and was ready to try something else. You have to remember, he had been at McLaren for a very long time. Not just the 5 years that he'd been driving with us in Formula One, but also part of the McLaren Young Driver program from the age of 13. And I think he just needed a change for a change. I think he did. He spoke to Red Bull. He spoke to Mercedes. He may have spoken to other teams for all I know. And he was in contract renewal time with us, McLaren. But in the end, of course, he did choose Mercedes. And there was a lot of influence from Niki Lauda and Ross Brawn, who personally made efforts, successful efforts as it turned out, to lure him. And remember also that he had a lot of loyalty to Mercedes-Benz anyway, because he'd always raced with Mercedes-Benz engines. I minded it. I didn't blame him, but I minded it because, I remember talking, there was disagreement within McLaren at the time. Some people said, oh, Lewis is getting too big for his boots, he's becoming difficult. There was a little bit of truth in some of that, but my view always was, you want the best driver you can possibly get, the best drivers you can possibly get. And if they're a little bit difficult, because by the way, the best drivers are unlikely to be the easiest, particularly once they become champions and once they acquire the gravitas of seniority, and Lewis had. But you want them, and by the way, that's what you earn your salary trying to do, to control them. What I mean is that he's not the simplest, easiest person. I remember the last race, which was Brazil 2012, which, tragically to have to say, is the last race that McLaren has won as of now, 6 years ago. Obviously, Jenson Button won that race. But Lewis could have won it and then hit trouble, and he walked through the paddock, through the little tiny hospitality, exactly the same rooms as just 4 years previously he had his day of days, the most extraordinary success, the 2008 World Championship. And I remember thinking, well, that's the end of that era. That's his last McLaren drive. And he went into his little room at the back, and I felt the need to say something to him. We'd become quite close, and I felt the need to say something to him. So I tapped at the door and walked in, and he had his race overalls round his waist, bare top, and he stood there, and he just went like that, as if to say, well, didn't win that race, did I? And I just stood there, and I didn't really have anything to say, but I just looked at him and I just said, that's all I did. I just clapped him for what he had done for McLaren and with McLaren in that time, and I'll never forget it. Still, if I bump into him, we always chatted, and we still sometimes send an email or a text message. And much misunderstood person, brilliant driver. Everyone will miss him when he's gone. So then, in the post-Lewis Hamilton era of McLaren, the drivers were Jenson Button and Checo Perez. And our car wasn't very good. 2013 car, for the first time, not really a car that was ever going to win a motor race. And then the next year, Kevin Magnussen replaced Checo Perez, 2014 car, again, a car that was never going to win a motor race. And in fact, Kevin Magnussen's podium in his very first race, his Grand Prix debut, Australia 2014, still McLaren's last podium more than 4 years ago, which is another disappointing statistic to have to relate. Anyway, 2015, again, no wins. And I think at that point, there began to be this feeling of, have we forgotten how to win? Why are we not winning? Bit of upheaval, changing situation between Ron and Martin, and eventually Martin's departure. Now, Martin actually did resign. He decided to leave. But there was tension between Ron and Martin at that time. I think they're chummy now. I think they're friends now. And if you speak to Martin, he will say to you, I've got a lot of time for Ron. I worked with Ron for 25 years and I've got a lot of time for him. And Ron will certainly say the same. But in the end, obviously, they did part company. And Ron kind of reinstated himself into the CEO position because he had been chairman, but now he made himself CEO. And that was all a slightly difficult period. Then after that happened, along comes Honda. And there was a lot of hope around Honda. Obviously, the Honda engine wasn't good, but there was a lot of hope and a big esprit de corps. Where with Honda, they're a mighty company. We knew their engine was problematic in 2015, and so did they, but we still had a very strong hope, confidence and belief that they would get there. So in the early days, in terms of managing the media, managing the comms, managing the messaging, it was absolutely, we win and lose together. We know how good Honda are. We will get there. We are making progress. It won't always be linear progress, but we will get there, even if it isn't always linear. And that was my absolute view of how the comms, the PR, should be managed. And for some time, I would say we did that well. And people would come to me and say, well done. You're doing so well to hold this difficult situation together, because all your guys are saying, responsible, professional, supportive things, whereas Red Bull is always slagging off Renault. And then in the end, I think probably towards the end of 15, I think it became impossible to control. There was so much frustration, so much disappointment. There wasn't a natural rapport or friendship between the Honda guys and the McLaren guys that would have helped to patch it up. For instance, if we'd all gone for a beer afterwards. That didn't really happen. There was a difficult cultural match as well. And in the end, I think it just descended into an openly antagonistic situation played out in the media. Not my finest hour, actually, as a comms director. And although it was possible to influence what Eric Boulier, Jonathan Neal, even Ron Dennis were saying, and Jenson Button, the person who it wasn't actually possible to influence at that time was Fernando Alonso. I would brief Fernando. I get on well with Fernando, obviously a brilliant driver, highly intelligent man. I would brief him, or at least talk through what might be the likely subjects and rehearse the answers. And he'd say, yep, I know what to say. And he would say his own thing. But he'd also use the media, famously saying during races, this is a GP2 engine, famously getting out of deck chair and relaxing in the sunshine, creating, an absolutely shareable viral image. No briefing can combat that kind of really quite clever media play by Fernando, and he does know what he's doing. So all of that was difficult around McLaren. And then we got to 2017. And perhaps there was a need for change. I don't know. Ron was already nearly 70, complete legend. I'm massively proud to have worked for him, massively grateful to him for his having given me the opportunity. And I did work for him for 10 years. Nothing lasts forever. So eventually it came to an end. And then Zak Brown arrived, and very different person, obviously younger, American, very commercial, energetic. But I suppose in the end it became clear to a few of us, Ikram Sami, myself, a few others, that perhaps, new era, new things. And, my departure as Ikram's very, very amicable. From a company that I had been, delighted and proud to work for, and still have lots of friends there, and still always look at the McLaren results when I look at qualifying and see how it's a bit depressing actually these days, but I still look for them. So my last race for McLaren was 2017 British Grand Prix. After that, I departed, and I haven't been to Grand Prix in that period in between, so it's more than a year. But that gives me, I think, a vantage point from which to look at the sport that I was so immersed in for more than 20 years, right at the centre of one of the leading teams, and as a journalist, involving myself before that with all the teams. And you know, those 20 years were intense. I was very, very, very involved. I didn't hardly had a waking thought that wasn't about Formula One, unfortunately. Anyway, so, but now with the vantage point of a year's absence, or just over a year's absence, what can I say about Formula One? Still the sport I love. Well, I think it's always been technical, but it's too technical. And because so many engineers have become so very senior, the grandee engineer, of course, is Ross Brawn, hugely successful person that we should all respect, had wonderful success at Ferrari, and then actually won the championship with a car bearing his own name. Pretty impressive. But still an engineer. And often in the sport these days, it's the engineers who get to the top. And then if those people end up running the whole sport, you perhaps have an over-complex sport. What we're talking about is the millennials and the Gen Zs who are beginning to find all this just a little bit too dull. So we do have a problem, and it does have to be solved, and I dearly hope it can be solved. But perhaps the solution has to be more radical than people realise. And maybe, having been out of the sport for a year, it's given me the vantage point to see that. And in W Series, which is what I'm involved in now, which is an all-new single-seater series for women drivers only, starting next year, 2019, we are going to make sure that we address some of those points. We won't dream of having a race that lasts an hour and a half. No way. We won't dream of having a race that lasts an hour. No way. There's no need. People like the start. People like the finish. And perhaps they like the middle if it's short enough. So if there's 10 minutes of a start and 10 minutes of an end and 10 minutes of a middle with a bit of action in it, yes. At the moment, with Formula One, you have a beginning, a muddle, and an end. Not a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the muddle is a long muddle. So we're going to certainly look at that. And we haven't decided on all our formats, but we will begin to think of innovative formats. I think also the character of the drivers has to come out much more. Much, much, much more. Now, often people perhaps watching this will say, well, why is Matt Bishop saying this? He's a PR man. He was part of the bloody problem. He was part of the controlling element that prevented drivers to be PR perfect. And by the way, he worked for McLaren, where everybody had to be, note perfect and never speak out of line. That was really Ron Dennis's ethos, I agree. That was. My own personal view is that we are in the entertainment business. And again, if a driver is going to show his, or in W Series case, her character, which I want them to, then yes, it's going to give us a headache sometimes. Yes, we're going to find something that may cause embarrassment to whoever has been criticised by that driver, or a sponsor may not always love it. And by the way, would it mean that more drivers probably said things they regretted or swore? Yes. Is that bad? No. We're in the entertainment business. So W Series, it's massively exciting to be in at the start, a startup, all new. We can do everything that we want in a new way. And because the drivers have not typically come up in this linear way, from karting to Formula 4 to Formula 3 to Formula 2 to Formula 1, but because in W Series they have not. They are racing Formula 3 cars. Some of them are raced in Formula 4. Most of them have done karting. Some of them have done GT racing. Some of them in their 30s. Some are in their teens. So they're very, very different types, all coming to this sport with a backstory. And the backstory is not the linear step. The backstory is all different. and we allow them to tell their stories for themselves, and we allow them to be who they want to be, and we allow them to, yes, disagree with each other, yes, criticize each other on Twitter, yes, have a pop at each other if they want to, but within the context of we're in W Series together, we're trying to do something to drive more women into the sport and learn how to race and learn how to win. And then the absolute crowning glory of W Series, of course, we want it to be successful in and of itself. We want it to be popular. We want people to watch it on television, on handheld devices. We want people to send each other WhatsApp messages around it. We want all that to happen. We want Gen Zs and millennials, and we think they will, recognize the fact that it is disruptive in an innovative way. And I think that we will, by bringing out the stories, bringing out the characters, allowing them to be who they want to be, and we'll allow them to tell their stories. And I think that you'll find a different constituency of fan will suddenly say, hang on a minute, I like this. And I think there may even be lessons that Formula One can learn from us. I hope so.